Her name is Lakshmi Sammarko, and she is our first woman, but more importantly, she's the Hamilton County Coroner. And she's going to talk to us about bad news today. She's currently licensed in 9 states. That's got to be tricky. I was interested that she went to Clifton Elementary School like my son, and then Cincinnati Country Day, but she says she's older than that, my son. Oh well. She was involved in the development of many of the minimally invasive procedure that treats strokes, aneurysms, cancers of the brain and spine currently used today. I love that. Thank you. She's involved with the Hindu Temple and the local Indian dance program. She volunteers at the UC College of Medicine. She's married and she has 2 children. They are a Cincinnati family, and they regularly attend the arts, the symphony, opera, ballet. Must be really nice kids. Professional supporters of professional and college sports. Her interests include photography. I wonder what she takes pictures of. Photography, Asian and Hindu art, traveling and gourmet cooking. She's an active athlete and enjoys skiing and tennis. And she comes to us in her spare time, which is a very nice thing, folks. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lakshmi Sammarko.
I like eating gourmet cooking. I don't.
Yeah. Gotta hold this thing real close to her.
Really close?
Really close.
Okay. So I do have 2 kids that are, well, one child really loves going to the opera and the symphony. And of course, that would be my 18-year-old daughter. My 15-year-old son goes on sufferance, but he does appreciate at least. You know, we hear a classical piece of music. What is that? And at least he recognizes a lot of it. So I think that's an important part of education. Yeah, classical music really does. It really triggers certain brain waves, and they help you think, and they help you process information. And I think it's important for children to be exposed to, especially to whatever they're listening to now, which I don't consider music. And apparently I'm old-fashioned, but that rap crap, that's what I mean, it just doesn't sound like music to me. You know, a little note about Tulsi Gabbard. She was the first Hindu woman ever to be elected to DC. And she came here to Cincinnati a couple of years ago and had a chance to meet her, and she was really phenomenal. And really appreciate what she's doing, and she's not afraid to speak up and make it happen. And you know, she's from, I remember meeting her and I said, well, wait a minute, you're Hawaiian. How do you get to be in, I mean, I'm Hindu, but you know, like, I don't understand this. And then she explained her background and how they got to Hawaii. But, there are quite a few Hindus. I don't know if you can see this, but I have henna on my hand. From this week, I was in Dubai for a cousin's wedding in Dubai. And it was a traditional Indian wedding, which means it was 4 days at least of celebrating, right? I was exhausted. I mean, we got off the plane and there was something to do, something to do, something to do. And they're 9 hours ahead, so, you know, I was already behind, so.
Were you on a horse?
Yes, actually, my cousin's son came in on a horse, decorated. And, you know, the bride's family met him. There was a lot of dancing, and it was actually quite fun. So, I need to talk to you about something serious, and I know you guys have probably heard a lot about the opioids and the epidemic that we're experiencing. And I said, Alberta, there's an element of fatigue now, you know, with people hearing so much of it. You can't hear me?
Yeah. You're closer.
Wow. Okay. Well,
We're
there's
all people in debt.
my children say that about me. But you know, there are people that are getting fatigued. You know, they're tired of hearing about it. They're tired of hearing about the drugs and the problems and we're having in our community. And unfortunately, drugs, the chain of events from that, you know, the domino effect, because we're also having a much higher rate of domestic violence. You know, you're going to hear, you probably heard on the news about the 15-month-old, and we consider that a homicide, but he's one of the ones that died, and that rate has gone up, but you would not believe the number of children who have been abused this year alone in our county, who fortunately have not died, but who've also had significant injuries, enough to put them in comas and, put them in wheelchairs, and it's pretty awful. So drugs in general, not only are they destroying our communities and our young people and our middle-aged people, but they're also resulting in a lot of crime and violence. So I'm not going to show you any photographs that I've taken, but unfortunately we can't have a discussion about drugs without talking about impaired driving. And we've had so many people in our county alone, but entire state of Ohio, who have been victims of impaired drivers, but the number of people driving impaired has skyrocketed in Ohio. And we used to talk about the heroin highway. The heroin highway was 71 between Columbus and Mansfield. Well, now it's pretty much the entire highway system in Ohio. From Canada all the way down to Florida, coming through here. People have asked, why do we have, why is Cincinnati such a problem? Why do we have such a problem here? Well, it isn't. I mean, yeah, we have a problem here and we're a lot more vocal about it, but don't kid yourself. Every part of this country is seeing a huge problem with opioids. Whether they acknowledge it or actually deal with it as actively as we do, it's not an unusual thing. I'm going to skip through some of these slides, but they're actually relating to how opioid is perceived, how it has been perceived in the past, how physicians used it from for the past many centuries, and how things have sort of changed. And I know many of you probably heard of laudanum. Laudanum at the time in the 19th century was a very popular thing. They'd mix it with sherry, with some wine, with some sugars that make it sweet, and they used it for everything from toothaches to headaches to teething pain for children. And when you think about that, they were giving children opioids for teething pain. And then we had the opium dens, and there were a lot of Asians that were brought from China to the United States, and they think that a lot of the opioids initially were introduced to this country through that immigration, and they were brought here to work on railroads and to do labor on both coasts, and we saw a lot of opium dens then. So morphine is something that's used widely. And for those of you that don't know, there are over 1,000 tons of morphine that are used every year. I'm going to flip through this timeline, but let's just say the first date on here is 3400 BC. So this is not something that we haven't seen before, but it was the first time the opium poppy was cultivated. And if you move forward to when the DEA was created in 1973 by President Nixon, to talk about 1999, when there was an opium crop of 4,600 tons in Afghanistan. And one of the reasons we've been in Afghanistan is to wipe out the poppies. And my friends that have come back from Afghanistan have told me we have not even made a tiny little dent. But the Taliban leader in year 2000, he banned the poppy. 2 years later, Afghanistan regained the position of being the largest producer. I'm going to skip this, but this was a DEA file. It was a video that shows one of these heroin/fentanyl operations and how they bring these huge packets of heroin and fentanyl, and then they package it down to what we call dime packets, which are about the size of a sugar packet. And they're called dime packets because they're used to sell for $10 on the street value. You can get it for $5 in some places now. And depending on if they're mixing it with fentanyl, carfentanil, which is a veterinary, very dangerous drug, or any of the other synthetic opioids, it might change the price. So I want to talk to you about 3 main drugs. And the reason I put carfentanil in here, even though we're not seeing a lot of carfentanil deaths anymore, is that it's a very lethal substance. So let's start with heroin. Heroin is an organic substance. What does that mean? It's grown. It's not synthesized in a lab. You can't just cook it up in your kitchen if you want to. You can't, you've heard of meth labs all night. You can't do that with heroin. You have to have the right growing conditions. You have to plant it. You have to cultivate it. You have to water it. You have to have sunlight. And so there's a timeline in being able to produce that. And most opium fields, most poppy fields, you can harvest from the same plant twice, and then you have to bulldoze it and grow and plant again. Fentanyl is synthetic. You can cook that up in a lab. And there are a lot of different, you can get them on the internet. I mean, there are a lot of different formulas you can get for fentanyl and fentanyl variants that we have seen, fentanyl analogs. Carfentanil is a fentanyl analog, essentially. It is a drug that was produced for veterinary use only, and only for really large animals. And in fact, most of the vets aren't even using it anymore in most vet hospitals because it is so dangerous. So I don't know if you can see this, but this is a little map of heroin trafficking. Where's it grown? Here's Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Colombia. Colombia has replaced its losses in cocaine with heroin. A lot of the mountainous regions are growing heroin now. And where's it going? Well, clearly everywhere. Even into Russia, out of Afghanistan, even though you don't see the arrows here. Some of it's grown here in Africa. But this has made its way around to the entire world. And my cousin works in the Central Reserve Police Force in India, and he said they're having a problem with the Southeast Asia heroin coming across the Nepali border into India and across the Pakistan border into India from Afghanistan. So how does opioid work? I think a lot of people don't understand. People say, well, how do people die from opioids? They stop breathing. It depresses the respiratory centers and they stop breathing. How does it work? Opioids bind to something called mu receptors in your brain and give you a sense of euphoria. And it's very addictive. Once they get that feeling, it could even be one. And I started doing that in school, saying, this is my one and done talk. You want to know what my one and done talk is? You're done. That means you're addicted for life or you're dead. Because either can happen if you use it even one time. So it fools the brain into that euphoria sensation. So you've heard of Narcan, naloxone, the blocking drug. How does that work? Well, thank God, Narcan has a higher affinity to the mu receptors than the opioids do. So when Narcan's flowing in the system, it'll go to those mu receptors, and it'll bind to them, and it blocks the opioids from binding. The half-life of Narcan is 18 to 30 minutes. That works pretty well for heroin and fentanyl. It does not work very well for carfentanil. Most of the time, anybody exposed to carfentanil will require multiple doses of Narcan immediately. And carfentanil's half-life, and again, it's a veterinary drug. We do not have any human studies on it, so we don't know what the half-life is in the human body. But veterinary use, half-life is 7.7 hours. Okay, so going back, Narcan is 18 to 30 minutes, which means somebody who's using carfentanil overdoses, EMS responds, they give them the carfentanil, they give them the Narcan, they wake them up. They refuse to go to the hospital, which is very typical, by the way. They get up and walk away, run away, and 30 minutes later, EMS is getting called again to see that same person. Does that mean that they used narcotics in the meantime, opioids? Not necessarily. They still have the carfentanil floating around in their blood. Narcan's already worn off. So the carfentanil binds again. And it's called re-narcotization. So that's something that we're definitely seeing. What does it do to you? Well, let's talk about the complications of it. Infections, endocarditis, HIV rise, hepatitis C is running rampant in our community right now. And the risk to your healthcare workers is huge. And it's become tenfold in the last few years. We have had dirty sticks in our office during autopsies. We've had 3 people exposed. HIV rates have significantly increased in Hamilton County in the last 5 years. What does it do? Well, you'll see pupil constriction, it affects your brain, respiratory depression, which is how they die, sexual dysfunction, that usually gets the teenagers, they hear that and they're like, right, well, if nothing else, this is why you don't want to do it. So, I'm a radiologist, and I think I'm probably the only radiologist coroner in the country now. There used to be another one in San Francisco, but she's since moved on to something else. So I'm actually a neuroradiologist. So after I did my radiology training, I did a 2-year fellowship in neuroradiology at UCLA. I came back and joined the Cleveland Clinic on staff for 3 years. So for me, I'm an expert on imaging of the brain. And one of the things that I noticed and that we were taught when I was in LA is to be able to quickly recognize the sequela of intravenous drug use in brains. And we saw a lot of it out there, didn't see as much of it here, did see a little bit of it at the Cleveland Clinic, and then in the Cincinnati, less. But one of the things that's important to note, though, is that there are physical changes in the brain. And this slide actually shows, we were talking, Dr. Bossi and I was talking about, dopamine and the dopamine receptors and how they're lower in addiction. But in this slide, you can see the very first line is cocaine. And on the left is your control, or your normal group of people. And on the right, it's your addicted group. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see that, but the red is decreased. We're going to switch mics. Is that any better? It might just be the speakers behind me. Is that better?
Good. Yeah, good. Her hand is over the transmitter. The thing is hot.
Oh, got it.
We're not.
I did have a nice spot there. It's gone. So you can see the red. You can see the red in what are called basal ganglia, or deep portions of the brain, and then you can see that they're decreased on the right. Same thing in alcohol, and same thing in heroin addiction. It's addiction. That's what's happening to the dopamine receptors. In fact, we were just having a conversation about, does this happen in the brain for internet addicted people? Because it is still addiction. So this is a very, those of you who aren't familiar with biochemistry and organic chemistry, but this is one of those slides that gives you a headache. So it's heroin here and how it metabolizes in the body. So when we're testing for heroin in somebody who's died, because the second step is morphine, how do we know they died of heroin versus morphine? Because we look for this. We look for that middle step, which is 6-monoacetyl morphine, 6-MAM. And that usually sticks around a while. So we look for that in the toxicology. Those of you who don't know what poppies look like, they are beautiful. And what do they do with them? Petals fall off. There's a pod left. And what they do is they score the pod with very sharp knives. And they let them sit. And then this stuff oozes out of those sharp cuts. And then they collect them like this. And there's actually a lot of child labor involved in this. A lot of kids are used to collect the stuff. They dry it, they process it, or they can smoke it, they can make powder out of it. Heroin comes in all sorts of colors. It can be white, it can be really dark brown. It can be smoked, it can be ingested, it can be put in the veins, any way you get it into the body. Yeah, some ways are a little bit more effective than others, but any way you get it into the body. And then,
Does handling it when they're harvesting it affect them?
no. So
Repeat the
these,
question.
well, he said when handling it, when they're harvesting it, will that affect the people handling it? No, does not. So I don't know if you see these little foil wrappers. You know, law enforcement has a really tough job. You know, not only are they trying to keep us all safe, but they're trying to keep the drugs out of our community. When they pull somebody over and they see these on the floor of the car, what's your first thought?
Go.
Hershey's Kisses, gum. Exactly, right? What do you do with gum when you're done? You want to spit it out, you put it back in the little foil wrapper and ball it up and, you know, throw it at the bottom of your car or whatever you do. But, I mean, that could definitely be that. If you don't open these up, you don't know that they contain drugs. Because a lot of times, this is how they come. And I can't tell you how many different ways we have found drugs in people's cars. Not hidden in seats or whatever, but plain sight. You remember this, Daph? Yeah, that wasn't that long ago. And, you know, he still had a syringe in his arm. And he did. He had a mix of heroin, cocaine. It was used to be called a speedball, the heroin and cocaine. But now it's mixed with a lot of other things, benzodiazepines and amphetamine, but that's just him. But I can tell you here locally, we're seeing a wide mix of things with the heroin. This is an actual photo from a scene. You know, we went to a drug overdose death scene, found this glasses case, and guess what was inside the glasses case? A completely loaded syringe with a needle on it, ready to go. So if this person was at work, or at school, or went to the bathroom, right? This is a shaving can, you know, shaving cream can. Flip it over on the bottom side, it's got a nice little dip. So if you don't have a spoon handy, put the stuff in here and heat it up. That's a typical puncture wound on an arm. And this is a typical drug overdose scene. And you know, one of the things I say to the high school students when I show them this is like, do you really want this to be the last picture your parents have of you? Here's a guy's arm here. Really? You want this to be, because this is the way they live. Because once they get hooked on drugs, they don't, you know, they don't care about anything else. All they care about, they don't care about stealing from their mothers and grandmothers and their children. All they care about is getting that next fix. Where am I going to get it? How am I going to get it? And, you know, once they get their fix and they're feeling a little more normal, then they start feeling guilty and bad about what they've had to do to get there. There are a lot of different street names for fentanyl and heroin. Theraflu, Breaking Bad, income tax. You know, you hear people talking about different things, you have no idea what they're talking about. Like I said before, fentanyl is synthetic. Fentanyl, when we use it, fentanyl is a great drug. I mean, it's a great drug in the right clinical setting. And I can tell you, as a neuroradiologist, I've done my share of angiography, which means, or if anybody's had a cardiac cath, same type of procedure where you have to put a little hole in somebody's groin in the femoral artery, snake a catheter up. And, you know, I used to get my patients in, my standing orders were giving Versed and fentanyl as a combination, and they would sleep. I would anesthetize your groin, put the catheter in, put a sheath in, ready to go, and they'd start waking up, and it would be 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And that's it. They don't feel any other pain once I'm doing the procedure. And it's so, the nice thing about fentanyl is it's easily reversed, it's short acting, it works really well with Versed, and it's a safe drug. Never did I imagine it was going to get used on the streets. In fact, the first time I heard about it was I was at the Ohio State Coroners Association meeting, which we hosted in May of 2013 here in Cincinnati. I was at the Westin, and I got a phone call. And my office said, there's an overdose death, and they don't usually call me for overdose death. And then, okay, you pulled me out of a meeting, why? I said, well, we think it's somebody you know. And I said, really? Okay. And then they named him, and it was the son of an Indian psychiatrist in town, a friend of my dad's, who's also a psychiatrist in town. It was somebody I did know. I considered him a kid, but he was 30. And I said, no, you have the name wrong. You double check the name, like, no, and here's the address, Doc. And I was floored, and I was speechless. I never would have imagined it. And so when we did the toxicology, though, on him, it was fentanyl he had gotten. He had become dependent on pain pills, and then after a motor vehicle accident, we found him in his parents' home with a needle in his arm, and he thought he was buying heroin on the street, and it turned out to be fentanyl. And fentanyl is 100 times more potent than heroin, so he died. And we started looking into, well, how are people getting fentanyl? Are they taking those little Duragesic patches and scraping them off and, injecting it? How are they getting it? And we did have a few victims where they were chewing on their Duragesic patches and they were in their mouths when we found them, and they did die. But then we realized that wasn't the only way they were getting it. It was on the streets. I mean, this is the way I was familiar with fentanyl. This is how we used it, injected it in the hospital. These are little lollipops for kids that need them at Children's Hospital. Here's some pills, and here's the patch, and, there are lots of famous people that have died of fentanyl overdoses since I know there. Prince, it was a combination of fentanyl and heroin. So I want to show you when I was saying that fentanyl is very potent. This is a painkiller equivalency slide, and it shows you what 1 milligram of fentanyl is equivalent to. 36,000 milligrams of aspirin. I mean, if anybody takes that much aspirin, they will bleed to death internally. But 100 milligrams of morphine. So it's 100 times more potent than morphine. This was another drug overdose scene we went to. And for those of you that can't read it, that says opiate overdose care instructions. This is somebody who had just gotten out of rehab. So they say that it takes 7 times in and out of rehab with opioids before somebody either gets clean or dies. 7 times. And I've had people tell me, oh, I'm clean. I'm clean now. I said, how long it's been? 2 years. You're not clean. I'm sorry, but opioids are something that I don't believe that even if somebody came up to me and said, I'm clean 10 years later, I'm not so sure I can understand that or believe that. This was another scene. You can see the little cap, syringe here, hiding the little bong in the cigarette packet. This was a used Narcan injector. Carfentanil. So as I was saying, carfentanil is a veterinary drug meant for animals that weigh 5,000 to 14,000 pounds, not 150 to 200 pounds. It's 10,000 times more potent than morphine. You can't read this, but on a strength comparison chart, this is the spectrum. Here's aspirin, here's carfentanil at the bottom. At least 10,000 times as strong. And a 10 milligram dose is enough to take down an animal that size. And actually, this was referenced in 2 different Jurassic Park movies where they talk about taking down Tyrannosaurus Rexes with carfentanil. That was one of them, actually. That one got 5 milligrams of carfentanil. So in Hamilton County, actually I don't have the new slide in here, I guess. We've had overdose deaths, as you've seen. When I started in 2012, it was 204. 2015 was 414. So we more than doubled. Last year was 403. And people say, oh, wait a minute, it went down. No, it didn't go down. That's a really misleading number. Why? Because we have now armed our EMS and our police with Narcan. And we have injected thousands of doses of Narcan to people. And yet we still have 403 overdose deaths. These are the heroin deaths, straight heroin. These are the combined, where heroin and fentanyl was seen in their blood. You can see this curve trend. And this is 237 in 2015. It's 342 in 2016. 2012 and 13, 7 fentanyl-related deaths. And you can see where that curve has gone. This is a little pie chart of our 2016 accidental deaths. We consider overdoses accidental. So what are the possibilities for manner of death? You have homicide, suicide, natural, accidental, or undetermined. So some people, and there's a coroner in Pennsylvania who's decided to call overdose deaths suicides. Because he claims that anybody that willingly injects or uses opioids knowing that they could die is committing suicide. We tend to go along with what most other coroners in the country do and call them accidental. Because most people, when they're using drugs, are not planning on committing suicide. They're just using it because they need to, because they're addicted, and they accidentally die. So out of this pie chart, though, of accidental deaths, 54% are drug overdoses. 54%. Next highest number is falls, the number of people that fall at home. And then you have this purple, which is motor vehicle accidents. So in the state of Ohio, from 2002 to 2012, to 2016, green represents your fentanyl and fentanyl-related deaths, or opioid-related deaths, and then the blue is a non-fentanyl or non-opioid deaths. And you can see this percentage increasing. The bright green up here is car fentanyl. Here's another scene, I'll go through this quickly. This is not typical because it's pretty clean, right? I mean, it looks pretty clean. There's a baby crib here. Mom used to sleep on the floor next to the baby's crib. That was the refrigerator when we opened the door. So they weren't worried about taking care of this kid. That's why we have so many opioid orphans in our community now. That was your dining table. That was your room where Dad was sleeping. So they can package, carry, hide the drugs anyway. We've had a number of industrial-related overdose deaths in businesses in the last couple of years. This is a slide from 2014-15, which is very similar to what we're seeing now. This is Hamilton County. The red are the pockets of where we're seeing the most overdose deaths. Price Hill, Central Business District area, over the Rhine, Bond Hill area, a little bit up here in the Reading-Evendale area. This is a slide of the state of Ohio from 2011 to 16, and you can see the dark blue, and we're probably a little bit darker now, where we're seeing the most number of deaths. A couple more slides to show you. The red line here is the fentanyl-related deaths. And you just, I mean, take a look at that compared to green, which is prescription opioids. Yeah, cocaine did go up. We've seen a 30% increase in number of cocaine-related deaths in Hamilton County in this last year. And we have seen fentanyl mixed with the cocaine. This is a slide that's showing the number of opioid doses that have been prescribed and dispensed from 2011 to 2016. As you can see, that trend is going way down. National overdose deaths. You can see this trend is going up. This is from heroin. This is from prescription drugs. This slide is kind of telling, I think, and the next slide will be as well. So this is 2002. Dark red is number of deaths per 100,000. You can see that increasing. 2002, 5, 8. This was 11, and this was 14. So anybody that tells you that this is a Cincinnati problem, we're here. Really?
Why is there such a big area that is showing blue in the last couple of slides,
The blue is where they're less affected by opioids.
There's not a lot of major highways going through there.
Well, first of all, it's less population too. This slide is on a year-to-year basis, and you can see that those numbers going up. And we don't have a new slide for 2015, but I assure you, it would be even more red. This was one of the overdose death scenes where we were talking. You started off the talk talking about impaired drivers. This is one of those guys right here underneath that sheet. Underneath that mural. So, I wish I had better news. I wish I could say that, you know, we're winning the fight. We're not. We're fighting the good fight. I try and raise awareness wherever I go. The average age of the opioid overdose deaths in our county is from about 25 to about 50 to 55. We've had a few higher and a few lower. I think our youngest is 16 in Hamilton County, dying of opioid overdose. But we've seen users younger than that. But in general, the National Institute of Drug Abuse has put out some figures for 2016. And I guess the encouraging news is that when they surveyed high school seniors, 70% of them said they're not interested in using opioids and never intend to use opioids. So maybe that's good. But on the other hand, 70% of them also said that they don't have any problem with using any other types of drugs. So, still have some work to be done, but you know, this is a community-wide, nationwide problem, and you know, I think the president had the opportunity to really make an impactful statement, you know, and really declare it a national emergency. Because, you know, how many times have we seen 60,000 deaths per year in a community in our country, and somebody not raising the alarm? I mean, if we saw that many deaths from an infection, the CDC would be all over it. And these numbers are going up. I mean, this is a national emergency. I don't know what you consider a national emergency, but come on, that's 60,000, that's a small town. That's wiped out. And you know, some of the drugs that that our law enforcement, DEA and our local law enforcement have picked up here locally were enough to wipe out a city of 3.5 million to 4 million people. I mean, the couple that was caught in Norwood, the amount of fentanyl they had was enough to wipe out this entire region.
You talked to us before, I mean, we know where heroin comes from and all that, and you said this is what fentanyl looks like when you see it at the hospital. How do they get a hold of it on the streets? What does it look like on the streets?
Fentanyl is being manufactured, and our federal partners tell us it's being manufactured in China, and it is being distributed in this country via Mexico. So the drug cartels in Mexico have found it very lucrative to become the distribution companies for these Chinese manufacturers. And it's mostly a white powder, but it can look like anything. It can be mixed with anything. I've seen it pink, I've seen it red, I've seen it purple, I've seen it mixed with Tang, Kool-Aid, all sorts of different powders. I mean, really, you have no idea what you're getting. And I keep saying this, and I'm like, I'm not kidding. Literally, you have no idea what you're getting when you buy drugs on the streets unless we test it in our lab. I couldn't tell you what's in it until we test it. So, you know, they could put battery acid and Dorito or whatever in there too, and you'd never know it.
Testing. I was addicted to Demerol from having surgery like every other day, hand surgery when I had an accident. So I was addicted and was off of it before I knew I was addicted. So apparently not everybody gets stuck on it like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some psychological issues that in fact make folks more or less likely to be addicted to anything, be it drugs, gambling,
Or internet.
sex, internet. If you can cross over something there.
Well, genetics are always involved.
Genetics, I'd say that's part of it. But I think early and consistent trauma makes folks more likely to be susceptible to addiction. I also think that 40 million union scale jobs would clean up 80% of our addiction problems. So I think it's cultural, socioeconomic, I think there's a lot of issues. I don't think it's as much chemical as we focus on. I think it's mostly cultural and socioeconomic.
Well, I mean, there's always, this isn't, none of these addictions exist in a vacuum. So there are social, economical, genetic, and psychological, absolutely.
Early trauma. And I know Ravi.
Mm-hmm.
And Namaste.
Katie, then she's got.
Some of the folks here have heard this before, but I wondered if Dick and I have been involved in this for 50 years. And my opinion is we should have forced treatment. These folks that are saved by Narcan should be taken to a long-term inpatient treatment program because it takes a year for the brain to start healing up. And I think we should have family members who can probate people. There are so many mothers who have daughters and grandchildren who are addicted, and there's not much they can do about it. I think we ought to do that. And we need long-term treatment, at least a year. Most of these programs, you said 7 rehabs? 7 rehabs of 3 weeks. It's like putting Band-Aid on cancer.
Yep.
And it really slays me that we're not doing it right. And then we blame the person with addiction. Oh, you don't really want to get well. But we're not providing what they really need. And it really irritates the hell out of me.
Well, it's a good point, but there are things that are available out there that are very effective. Like, for example, Vivitrol. Vivitrol type drugs are out there. And there are some judges, including some of the judges in Warren County, that are mandating, here are your choices. Go to jail, or you get on this program, and you're going to be monitored regularly. Don't miss your appointments, or you're going to go to jail. And we'll see what happens. And it's actually working. And it's working great for these people. Yeah, it's $1,000 a shot. But do you know how much it costs to incarcerate somebody? I mean, per month? In Hamilton County, it's almost $2,000 a month to incarcerate somebody. So I'm willing to give it the $1,000. I mean, saving everybody money, and it's more effective. And incarcerating your way out of an addiction is not effective. It's not going to work. The sheriff and I put a video together because we were seeing so many overdose deaths on these people that are out of jail. They're out of jail, and then in the first week they'll overdose. And so we decided to put a video together because we have to get the message to these people. So before they get released, they get to watch this less than 1 minute video. And we kept it short because, you're being released and you're going to go out there and you're not thinking about, watching a video and paying attention. You got a short attention span, let's just make it quick and sweet. And what we said was, listen, you've had an opportunity to get clean while you're in jail. Just stay clean. Take this opportunity, stay clean, redo your life. And if you don't, and you want to do something stupid like going back to using drugs again, just remember that your tolerance is much lower than it was when you came in here. So using the same amount of drug as you used on the day that you came in here will kill you. And we have not, knock on wood, have not seen any overdose deaths within that first week of being released since we put that video out. So.
I've heard many times that the way most people get addicted is through prescription drugs for pain, and something like 20% of the people will get addicted will get addicted who take opioid for pain. So how do you manage the prescriptions? My granddaughter went into the ER with a sprain last year from soccer, and the ER doctor wrote out a prescription for opioids, and she was 15. Luckily, my daughter had enough sense not to get it filled. But what if she was one of those 20% who can't take them? And how do you know? And what's being done about it? The pharmaceuticals, I remember when they were teaching all of the medical students, pain is not necessary anymore. Stay ahead of it, make sure you give them all the drugs to keep the pain down, they'll heal faster. Isn't that's being changed, I know, but would you speak to that?
I was one of those medical students that was taught that. So, actually, this is a whole nother, probably several hour long discussion, but I'll keep it short. The number of pain pills that are being prescribed has shown a tenfold decrease in the state of Ohio. One of the reasons is that we track it. We track it now. Every pain prescription that somebody writes is tracked. And, before you write another pain prescription, a pill prescription for somebody, you're supposed to check and see their record to see when was the last time they got narcotics or opioids from somebody. Not just you, but anybody. When was the last time? How much did they get? Are they within the period that you can give more? And, a lot of doctors now restrict their prescriptions to 2 weeks. 2 weeks at a time, and if you need more, you're going to have to come back and see me. But, there are a lot of problems in that also, because coming back and seeing somebody isn't necessarily that easy. First, they have to get an appointment. And everybody is so busy now with all the changes in healthcare, it's hard to get an appointment in that short period of time. And number two is, who's paying for this? And this goes back to, and I don't know if you're all aware of this, but I will speak up for my profession. Physicians were ordered to provide adequate pain control. And if we didn't, then we were going to be penalized. Okay, so this was something that passed in the late 90s and going into the early 2000s. Well, that's how we believe it started, right? With pharmaceutical companies lobbying in DC and making that a requirement for the state medical boards to comply. The state medical boards comes down the list to us. So this requirement went into place, and if you don't provide adequate pain control for your patient, you're going to be liable for X, Y, Z, and so forth. And that was also part of the continuing medical education teaching that we all received as physicians. And most physicians treated that with discretion. 99% of physicians out there are not in medicine for, let's say, to make their fortune. That's just not going to happen. I mean, the time you put in undergrad, in then medical school, then residency training, and then afterwards, and the number of soccer games you've missed, and musicals that your kids have been in, and important things to your family. You don't do that. You don't do that for a little bit of money. There's a lot better ways to make money. Most people are in it to help people. And, if you treat physicians, if you allow physicians to treat their patients the way they're trained and to follow their conscience and to follow their training and do the best for their patients, things work out well. The minute you start legislating what a physician should or shouldn't do, and you're legislating them not based on your own expertise, but based on some nebulous public policy, then you start heading into trouble. Because do you want some legislator telling you or telling your doctor how to treat you? I don't. I mean, my doctor has the training. When I go see her, I trust her. She's got the training, and I trust her to treat me how she thinks best. I don't want somebody in DC or Columbus telling her what to do.
Last question over here. Are any of these victims ever eligible to be organ donors?
Yes. That's a great question. So we work with the Donating Life organization, and there are some overdose victims who are organ donors, And basically, we have to look at the circumstances and see if they have any evidence of communicable diseases or HIV or hepatitis C and how that might affect things, what other things they were on. And depending on their condition, we may say, okay, you can take these organs, but not these organs. Or, we may say you can't take any of them at all. And when they come to us as coroner cases, we kind of have to make a decision based on their history of what's safe to harvest and what isn't.
Are you involved with the Hamilton County Heroin Coalition?
Yes. So that actually, and there's a lot of people who don't know how that started, but about 4 years ago, we heard about Cuyahoga County doing something in the way of a drug task force like that. And that's when we first heard about it. They had a couple of cases. And we asked them to send us a copy of their protocol. And we still have that copy, actually. And we looked at that, and then we approached our Hamilton County Chiefs of Police Association, and that's where Tom Sinan came into it. And we showed them and said, what do you think? Can we start something like this? And then that started the ball rolling. And I think our coalition has been very effective. We have great partners with our local U.S. attorneys, our FBI and our DEA offices, and we've been able to get a lot of really dangerous people off the street and try and control a lot of the drugs that have been coming in here. I mean, obviously, we're not 100% successful, we just keep trying.
Could you explain a little bit what that protocol is? Or?
Yeah, essentially what happens is when we get a call for an overdose death, our investigators, and we have 6 investigators in our office, will go to the scene, and if it looks like it's a heroin or opioid related overdose death, they will basically engage the Hamilton County Heroin Coalition Task Force. And their officers are different investigators, but they will show up at the scene, and what we do is our investigators will hand off things that are going to be helpful to them, like the victim's cell phone. And they'll look at whatever information they have, including the cell phone, and we'll look at the last few phone calls, and then they will backtrack and try and find the dealer, the person that sold them or gave them the drugs, and lean on them to get people above them and try and get back as much as high as they can, and working with the federal government and the U.S. attorneys to try and increase their sentences. So the reason it's useful to work with the U.S. attorneys on this is federal sentencing is a lot higher, a lot more onerous than our local is. I mean, some of our dealers, they go in, they're out in just a few days. They go into jail. Whereas if they go in through the U.S. attorney's office, it's 5 years and plus. So, if you could be traced to a death caused by an overdose and you were responsible for giving or selling those drugs, then the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to be interested in prosecuting.